12,000 cars were towed in Ouagadougou, but not a single parking lot had ever been built. This wasn't crime. This wasn't carelessness. This was survival punished in broad daylight. Mothers returning from the market, fathers leaving hospital gates, elders with rice bags, street vendors catching their 1 hour of rest. All of them returned to find their cars hoisted or fined as if simply existing in public had become an offense. The fine, 50,000 CFA francs. The crime, trying to live in a city that had no room for them. There were no signs, no garages, no instructions, just chains, clipboards, and cold silence. And no one, not a single city official, asked the one question that truly mattered: if there is no place to park, whose fault is it? The press didn't cover it. The global news cycle missed it. But someone was listening. President Ibrahim Traoré didn't send a memo. He walked the street. No camera crew, no grand statement. Just one leader who knelt beside the people before ever standing for them. And that's when everything changed. This isn't a story about traffic. It's a story about trust. About how one moment of silence can speak louder than years of laws. If you believe that justice doesn't begin by humiliating the vulnerable, if you believe that cities should serve the people who build them, if you believe that leadership means listening, not commanding, then stay with us. Because what happened next in Burkina Faso will redefine what governance can mean for a continent and maybe even for the world. Subscribe if you believe laws must protect, not punish. Comment if you've ever paid the price for surviving where the system failed you. For 6 long months, the streets of Ouagadougou bore witness to a quiet kind of punishment. It didn't come with sirens or court orders. It came on the back of tow trucks. Over 12,000 vehicles were lifted from the ground. Not because they blocked ambulances, not because they belonged to criminals, but because they were parked beside clinics, markets, fruit stands, because someone dared to pause in a city that had offered no space to stop. There were no signs, no garages, no warning. Only tickets slapped onto windshields like verdicts passed down without trial. A mother who left her car for 10 minutes to buy fever medicine for her child returned to find it dangling mid-air. She didn't argue. She didn't scream. She simply sat on the curb holding the medicine close and wept. Nearby, an elder man watched as a truck pulled away with the car his son had lent him for a heart checkup. He stood still, not with rage, but with disbelief. In his silence, something broke not in him, but in the system that had forgotten him. And these weren't isolated events. They happened daily, repeatedly, quietly. 12,000 small punishments multiplied by the absence of infrastructure. There were no alternatives offered, no public garages, no affordable options. Just a city that enforced without providing, demanded without preparing. What made it worse was the absence of acknowledgement. No news reports questioned the fairness. No city official stepped forward to ask, is it justice if the poor must pay for the failure of the planners? So the people adjusted. Some walked for miles to avoid the risk of parking. Others sold groceries to pay their fines. Most simply learned to live smaller, to shrink themselves into the margins, not afraid of criminals, but of clipboards, of chains. The silence was thick, not with peace, but with resignation. And yet from within that silence, a presence began to stir, not through megaphones, not through protest banners, but through something even more radical: quiet attention. President Ibrahim Traoré didn't send envoys. He didn't host a press conference. He walked through the neighborhoods, past the markets, to the street corners where women had cried, where elders had stood alone. He came with no security detail, no photographers, just questions. And one morning that question was asked not in parliament, but on the pavement. An elderly woman sat on an overturned bucket beside her chained vehicle. She clutched a woven bag of tomatoes and whispered, "I have parked here for 10 years. They never gave us another place. Today, they take it." The officer didn't respond. He didn't even look at her. He stared at his clipboard, preparing to deliver yet another fine. That's when Traoré stepped forward. He didn't yell. He didn't scold. He simply placed a hand over the clipboard and slowly turned it face down. Then he bowed his head just slightly toward the woman, just enough for her to know he had heard. And in that moment, something larger than a command was given, something unspoken but irreversible. The officer froze. The crowd grew still, and then Traoré made his decision. All enforcement paused until dignity is restored. No more fines, no more towing, not until the system could answer for its own failure. By nightfall, tow trucks had been recalled, fines were frozen, officers were told to return not with chains but with questions. It was not a law, it was not even a policy, it was a moral stand. And in that single gesture, the turning over of a clipboard, a government turned direction. Not everyone agreed. Behind closed doors, a senior official objected, "If we let sentiment guide the law, we lose the city." But Traore had already chosen where to stand, not inside chambers of policy, but outside on the sidewalk beside the people. Because the real question was never about traffic, it was always about belonging. Can you govern a people you have not made room for? That is the question Traore asked without ever needing to raise his voice. And in doing so, he started something that would ripple far beyond the streets of Ouagadougou. What happened next didn't begin with celebration. It began with disbelief. No one expected the government to follow through. They had heard promises before, but this was different. 12,000 names, 12,000 fines, 12,000 quiet acts of punishment, each now traced, documented, and prepared for refund. The total over 1.2 billion CFA francs, roughly $2 million US dollars. Not returned through paperwork and delays, but through transparency and human contact. President Traoré didn't call it compensation. He called it la restriche, the registry of repair. At local centers across Ouagadougou, staff waited with envelopes and apologies. Not scripts, not slogans, just a quiet sentence repeated again and again, "This is yours, and we are sorry." A mother named Isada came with a wrinkled fine she had carried in her purse for months. She didn't come for the money. She came to see if the nation would finally look her in the eyes. When the clerk handed her the envelope, she didn't open it. She stared at it for a long moment, then whispered, "So we are not invisible anymore." And then she wept not for the refund, but for the recognition. Across town, a retired schoolteacher named Boubacar sat on a folding chair in a dusty community hall. He had been towed 6 months earlier while bringing books to a literacy class. When his name was called, he rose, signed the registry, and said, "I didn't need money. I needed memory. But now I have both." This was not a public relations stunt. This was a moral reckoning. But what followed stunned even Traoré's closest advisors. People began to give back, not because they were asked to, because they had been seen. A baker left fresh bread on the steps of a city office. A mechanic offered free oil changes to single mothers who had been fined. A youth group dropped off water and fans for the workers issuing refunds. One woman, Hajara, whose savings had been drained by a mistaken ticket, began organizing a team to sweep the local lot each evening. She said, "This is not just a parking space. This is where my anger became useful." What began as a government correction had become a community restoration. But Traoré wasn't done. To heal, you don't just remove the scar, you restore the ground where the wound was made. And so he issued a command no one expected. "We will build 120 parking lots, free, permanent, public, not just anywhere, but on the exact same sites where people had once been punished. The places where mothers cried, elders stood forgotten, and citizens paid for a failure that wasn't theirs." The process was radical in its simplicity. No private developers, no meters, no fees, no apps, only community involvement. Neighborhoods were invited to name, design, and claim their lots. Youth groups submitted sketches, elders proposed names, artists painted murals. Every district was asked, "What does justice look like here?" One lot was named after Thomas Sankara. Another honored Wangari Maathai. One bore the name of a local midwife who had once been fined while rushing to deliver a child. They called it Mama's Haven. A consortium of private contractors tried to intervene. They proposed smart meters, modest hourly fees, and long-term management rights. Traoré's reply was swift and final. "These are not business opportunities. These are apologies. You do not sell your apology." In that moment, the room went still. And for the first time in decades, a public space was protected not by law, but by memory. And the lots themselves transformed. By day, vendors set up food stalls. Children played football on the edges. Elders met under the trees to talk politics. A group of teenagers began hosting a weekly reading circle they called Parliament of the Pavement. Police officers once feared in these streets now walked them without confrontation. One said, "We used to punish need. Now we protect space." Even the asphalt became sacred, because it carried memory, because it was built not on profit but on pain turned into purpose. And the question lingered, can a slab of pavement become a symbol of justice? In Burkina Faso, the answer was becoming visible, one painted sign, one clean corner, one unchained car at a time. 12 months after the first fine was refunded and the first lot opened, a new sound echoed through the streets of Ouagadougou. It was not the rattle of chains. It was not the whine of tow trucks. It was conversation. It was law being rewritten in the voice of the people. President Ibrahim Traoré did not convene a cabinet. He did not summon lawyers or foreign consultants. He stood instead in the center of a courtyard surrounded not by ministers, but by the people who walk the street vendors, school teachers, elders, mechanics, students, and bus drivers. And he asked a question that had never been asked by a president before. What should the law sound like when it speaks to you? For too long, the language of law in African cities had echoed from above, issued in penalties delivered by uniforms interpreted by strangers. But what if it could come from below? What if the street could speak back? From that day, a movement took shape not in courts, but in community centers, not on paper, but on pavement. The new street code of Burkina Faso was born. Its first principle was both simple and seismic: no punishment without provision. If the government had not provided a means to comply, the citizen could not be penalized. No parking lot, no fine, no sign, no ticket, no path, no restriction. The burden of order, Traore said, must first fall on those who hold power, not on those trying to survive it. The second principle redefined public protection. The vulnerable come first. In every urban zone, space would be guaranteed without fees or surveillance for the elderly, people with disabilities, pregnant women, low-income workers, not as an act of pity, but as recognition of their contribution, their resilience, their right to belong. And third, perhaps most radically, a tribunal of citizens would be established in each district to hear appeals for street-related offenses. Not a court of law, a council of neighbors, ordinary residents elected by their community who knew the rhythm of daily life, who could tell the difference between neglect and necessity. In one neighborhood, a woman who had sold fruit on the same corner for 20 years was selected to chair the tribunal. She said, now when someone is fined unfairly, they don't go to a stranger. They come to us. This wasn't just legal reform, this was a cultural inversion. The city no longer existed to discipline the people. It was now shaped to serve them. And the transformation went deeper still. Graffiti once etched in fury began to fade, not scrubbed off, but overwritten. Murals emerged in their place, painted by youth in partnership with local artists. Messages read, "We park here because we build here. This space is ours, not theirs." Even police officers changed. Previously trained only in enforcement, they were now expected to attend weekly community briefings. They met with neighborhood leaders. They listened not just to complaints, but to patterns. One officer, once known for aggressive towing, said, "It used to be us versus them. Now we walk the same streets." Power, once centralized in paperwork, and punishment had become distributed through presence. People began to feel the law not as weight, but as balance. And through it all, Ibrahim Traoré remained in the background. He never gave a victory speech. He claimed no credit. When asked how the reform happened, he answered plainly, "The people wrote the law. I only signed my name." In a time when global governance is often defined by force control and surveillance, what happened in Burkina Faso offered a radical alternative. Not law as decree, but law as dialogue. Not order as submission, but order as shared space. And it changed how people behaved, not out of fear, but out of ownership. Mothers no longer had to beg to park near a clinic. Men in wheelchairs found designated space where once they were towed. Vendors no longer feared losing their carts because of an invisible line, because the rules no longer whispered, "You don't belong here." They now declared, "This space is yours." In the shadow of bureaucracy, a new civic architecture had taken root, one built not from concrete alone, but from care, memory, and trust. The result wasn't perfection. It was something braver: repair. And in that repair, the citizens of Burkina Faso rediscovered something that had been stolen by silence: their voice. This story didn't trend on global headlines. No CNN special, no World Bank press release, no viral hashtags. Because when Africa repairs itself not through revolution or riot, but through reflection and reform, the world often looks away. But maybe it shouldn't. Because what happened in Ouagadougou isn't just about Burkina Faso. It's about us. About how any society decides who belongs and who merely survives. In the United States, millions of Americans, especially in Black, Latino, and working-class communities, know what it feels like to be fined without cause surveilled, without safety punished for trying to live where systems have failed them. How many tickets have been issued in cities where no parking signs contradict each other? How many families have watched their cars towed while dropping off medicine or groceries? How many people have stood on the sidewalk not in protest, but in quiet disbelief wondering, does anyone in power even see me? That's why this story matters. Because it shows that justice is not a product of wealth or Western design. It can emerge from clay roads, community halls, and leaders who listen before they legislate. President Ibrahim Traoré did not give a fiery speech about justice. He gave his presence, he gave time, and then he gave the ground back to the people. In a world where power too often hides behind policy, he stepped forward not to command, but to confess, not to boast, but to build. And in doing so, he reminded all of us, whether in New York or Nairobi, Atlanta or Ouagadougou, that true leadership doesn't fear accountability. It welcomes it. So to anyone who still believes that Africa only imitates, to anyone who thinks justice must look like courtrooms and uniforms, send them this story. Let them see what it looks like when a nation does not wait to be rescued. Let them hear the question that echoed across the asphalt in Burkina Faso, can freedom begin, where we stop punishing survival? In America, that question still waits for an answer. In Burkina Faso, it's already been written into the ground. Under the midday sun in Ouagadougou, an old man walked slowly toward a newly painted sign, "Free Parking Zone." He wore a long beige tunic. His hands trembled slightly as he laid down a bouquet red, yellow, and white flowers wrapped in torn newspaper. When a journalist asked him why, he paused and whispered, "Because for the first time I feel like I have a place in this city. A place that is mine, even if I own nothing." That's what this story is truly about. Not about parking, not about politics, but about something older, something deeper, the right to belong. 12,000 fines were not just refunded, they were remembered. 120 parking lots were not just built, they were redeemed. And a new law wasn't just passed, it was co-written by the very people it once punished. Burkina Faso didn't need a miracle. It needed humility. It needed leadership willing to say, "We failed you, and now we will make it right." And maybe that is the real warning for the world. Because we live in a time when governments race to digitize, militarize, and monetize every corner of public life, where order too often means control, and efficiency becomes an excuse to ignore the vulnerable. But what if the future belongs not to those who govern through fear, but to those who govern through repair? In Burkina Faso, the law no longer lives in paperwork. It lives in pavement. It lives in the eyes of elders who no longer fear uniforms, in the hands of mothers who no longer hide their cars, in the laughter of children who now play where chains once clinked. So, here is the question for you. Can justice begin with a pause? Can freedom grow in silence? Can repair replace revenge? We believe it can. If you do too, share this story. Share it with someone who still believes Africa only follows, with someone who thinks dignity cannot be designed, with someone who has ever asked, "Do I matter here?" Because in Burkina Faso, under the leadership of President Ibrahim Traoré, the answer is being written not in declarations, but in deeds. Please share if you believe this is what leadership should look like. Subscribe if you still believe the law should listen. Comment if you've ever felt unseen and now believe that maybe, just maybe, the ground is shifting.